A lilac cone on a poison thorn in a dress dirty and torn. Youngins a playing as the black crow flies. Mama's weeping, hear the mountains cry. There was another, a wild dirt flower. Cold was her heart in its darkest hour. Tears on the ground where her love did die, 'neath the bloody moon, hear the mountains cry.
It's a chilly morning down here in southeast Tennessee. I think right now it's only about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. But today I'm on the banks of the Hiwassee River. This is my favorite river to fish at here in southeast Tennessee. Catch you some trout, walleye, largemouth, smallmouth. Basically any kind of fish you could about think of that's here in this area. Crappie, lots of sunfish. Made several fishing videos up here over the last couple years or so. But I'm not here to fish today. Came up here to Reliance. Picked me up a couple of gallons of raw milk from the farm that I get it from. It's good stuff. It's made me a lot stronger the last couple of months. It's good for you. It's healthy. But today, the reason I'm here is I've got you a story. Let me take a seat and we'll get into it. Found me a nice little seat here, I reckon. But today's story, it is a story from the Appalachian Diaspora. You have to forgive me, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that word. But I listened to a podcast between my friend Pat and Blackbird 9 the other day. It's not the podcast that was on Surviving by America. This was one that they had done on Blackbird 9's channel. If I can remember to, I'll put a link to it in the box below. But something that Pat was talking about was the Appalachian Diaspora. The Appalachian Diaspora, if you think about it, the founding of this country, the Appalachian Mountains were the western frontier. This is the land of the Over Mountain men who marched down from Elizabethton, Tennessee, what is now Elizabethton, Fort Watauga. They marched through my hometown, through the area. Wasn't a town back then. They walked through the area, crossed Roan Mountain, marched all the way down to Kings Mountain, South Carolina, and they whipped the British's ass. But if you think about it, not all, but most of the settlement of this western, of this country, most of the settlers had to cross the Appalachian Mountains to go out further west. Not all, but most. And what I consider Appalachian Diaspora, or Diaspora, this is more of a modern thing, back in the 20th century. See what would happen. This Appalachia has always been kind of a poor place. Not a lot of opportunity. We didn't have many slaves here at all. Practically none during the Civil War, because the land is not conducive to having large plantations. The soil is rocky. It's fertile, but it's not conducive to large-scale agriculture. And honestly, over the years I've come to see it that poverty can have its blessings. But the Appalachian Diaspora is, back in the 20th century, leading up to and after World War II, a lot of these families, especially the younger children, they didn't have a lot of opportunity here. Perhaps the bit of land that the parents would pass down to the children usually went to the eldest children. What would happen, you see, not a lot of industry here, not a lot of industrial opportunity either. Sure, we had the TVA, which I have very mixed feelings about. But once the construction of the various hydroelectric dams on the Tennessee River and the surrounding tributaries that flowed into the Tennessee River, once the dams were constructed, not a lot of opportunity. So what would happen is these families would pack up and they would move to the industrial north. They would also settle in places like Atlanta. And these Appalachian migrants, they faced a lot of hardship in their new homes. And they would set up small communities within the large industrial cities of the North and the South. The two that come to mind that Pat has shown me and I've looked into further myself, there's a place called Cabbagetown down in Atlanta, Georgia. It's kind of a miniature Appalachian enclave within the city. There they have quilting bees. They look out for each other. Another one that is probably much larger was called Uptown, up in Chicago, Illinois. And you see these Appalachian little enclaves. They popped up in the various industrial cities. A lot of Appalachians went to Cincinnati, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, and probably some other, perhaps Pittsburgh and elsewhere. They did this in order to make some money. Because like I said, Appalachia has always been economically depressed, you could say. Even here we have been exploited for decades, perhaps even centuries, you could say. I think of the coal mines that are prominent up in central Appalachia, West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky. There's some coal mines here in the further west regions of East Tennessee. There's none up where I was raised in the far northeast corner of Tennessee or western North Carolina. Up there, tourism is largely the biggest provider, you could say, nowadays. But anyways, these Appalachian Diaspora, they would even form gangs to look out for themselves in their neighborhoods. They were often looked down upon by, say, the native whites in these cities, who considered them uneducated, wild, and uncouth. They considered them hillbillies. And also these diaspora Appalachians, they had to contend with other races as well. A lot of the blacks and even the Hispanics who had started to roll in. And they would form gangs. And this goes back to an old video I'd made talking about the syndicate. I'll put a link to it here. If I can remember, I'll put it in the description box below. This is a natural response to a group of people, you could say a tribe or an ethnicity, this is a natural response of them moving into an area that is not particularly ideal, that is not, that is honestly even hostile sometimes. But what I have for you today, and it got me to thinking, and it reminded me of a story that I was told years ago by one of my best friends back home. Now, the only reason I'm going to tell you this story is that the men involved have been dead for many years now. This is a story of Appalachian Diaspora Retribution. It is a story of vengeance. It is a story of immense brutality and of a vigilante justice in its most vicious and brutal form. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is because me and my friends, we have a little project on Telegram. It's called Heritage Appalachia. I'll put a link to it in the channel in the box below. You can check it out. We run it on Telegram. And what it is we are trying to remoralize the Heritage Appalachian. Because this is my area, this is my home, Southern Appalachia, by extension Central Appalachia. It's where my heart is. And I don't even know if remoralization is the correct term. I don't even know if that's a word actually, but you know, nowadays in these dissonant spheres we see so much fucking demoralization. You know, I get tired of the endless posting of videos of whites or Native Europeans being preyed upon by the non-whites. This is remoralization. I want to see otherwise. Because this victimhood, this groveling, it ain't going to get us fucking anywhere. So let's go to the story here. And you know, this story, it's not only for the Heritage Appalachian. It's a story for the white man in general. Because I see it that regardless of whether you're here in Appalachia, Central Appalachia, Ameriqua, Canada, Europe, and all the other lands that our race, our extended family has settled and made their own, this is a story for you as well. But I'll start out, give you a little background. I'm trying to paint a picture here for you in as full and vivid detail as I possibly can. In this video here, if you want to see how I was raised, where I was raised, if you want to see my little place back home up in the holler, a little house there, in my family's land, check out that video. Link to it in the box below. It's called Up in the Holler Home Part 5. You see, I grew up in a working class family. My father worked as a machinist, and in his later years, as a welder. My mom was a stay-at-home mom up until I was about 16. There were 4 of us. We lived in a small house. Me and my younger brother had bunk beds. And we never had a lot of money, but we did have a decent little patch of land. We had a decent little amount of land. My father, other than his job, he gardened, raised a lot of potatoes and would sell them, some other produce. He also hunted a lot of ginseng once the fall came to help supplement the income. We never really did get to go on many vacations growing up. Hardly ever. If we was able to travel down to Pigeon Forge for a couple of days, that was a vacation. We didn't get to do it often. I'd never seen the ocean until I was 12 years old. I only seen it once until I'd gotten out of high school. So see, we weren't spoiled. But I had an idyllic childhood. Looking back on it, you know, it was like every day was a vacation in a way. And you know, my parents, they were kind of strict on us. Me and my younger brother, we could be quite mischievous and sometimes just downright hellions. They'd bust our ass. But overall, I had a very loving and sort of idyllic childhood. My parents, they did a damn fine job, I believe. Now, two of my friends, I will call them Fred and Jay. They lived just a couple of miles away on a different holler. And there was only 3 houses on this holler. It was a holler within a holler, you could say. And it kind of illustrated the income disparity, I guess you could say, that we see here in southern and central Appalachia. My friend Jay, he was the 6th of 7 siblings. He was a few years older than me, 4 or 5 years older than me. I knew him in school. And my friend Fred, he lived up at the top of the holler. He was a couple of grades under me. I knew him better as we were growing up because we were in the same age group. Now my friend Jay, he was the 6th of 7 children, 5 brothers, 2 sisters. And I'm not saying these things in the least to be judgmental or anything, because I ain't like that. But he and his family, they grew up extremely rough. They grew up in a very small house at the bottom of the holler. And they had it hard growing up, especially the older siblings. My friend Fred, he lived at the top of the holler, and I would classify them, his family, as probably upper middle class. Now, Jay and Fred, they are of German ancestry. They both have German surnames. And my friend Fred, he kind of exemplifies what I would consider the typical German way of operating. He is very meticulous and owns his own business. And that's how I got to know Jay very well. Once I got out of college, I didn't go work at a bank or for any financial institution. I went and worked for my friend Fred. He had a landscaping business. We mowed a lot of yards, did landscaping jobs, cut trees, cut firewood, you know, stuff like that during the spring, summer, and fall. I did that for several years before the years of meth really got kicked off, you could say. And Jay worked with us. Worked with us every day. And you see, Fred's father, Gene. Now see, I said that Fred was upper middle class. They had a really pretty place and a really nice house that his father had built back in the early 80s. And I'm not saying these things to make Fred seem like he had a silver spoon stuck up his ass, because he never did. His father was born poor, one of the youngest of several children. And his father was a successful contractor and builder. He built many houses, many of the houses, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early aughts, up there in the town that I'm from. I knew Gene. He was a really good man. And Fred was a very hard worker. He worked us hard, me and Jay. He was successful. And I'm grateful for that for all those years, absolutely. And he's still been successful. He's just meticulous, very detail-oriented. The typical German mind is what I would call it. Now, the story that I'm going to tell you is about Jay's father and Fred's father. I'll call Jay's father C and Gene. Now, Gene, his older brothers, I mentioned earlier, they were part of this Appalachian Diaspora. Except his family would always return home after working, say, 3, 6, 8 months off in a factory up north, usually up in Cincinnati or perhaps Cleveland. They'd go up there, work several months, make them a bag of money, come back home, come back to the holler. And in the early 70s, Gene and C went up to Chicago, Illinois. I think they were on the south side. They were building apartments. They were up there for many months. And I've talked a little bit about Gene, who Fred is much like. Meticulous, detailed-oriented, a mind for business. A mind for success, you could say. Now, C, he was a very wild man. He was a very hard man. He could also be a very brutal man. I've heard plenty of stories back home, and I'm not saying these things to judge or anything. You know, that family, Jay's family, they lived at the bottom of the holler. I never knew C. He passed away before I got close with Jay and his family. But I knew his mother, and I knew his siblings. I knew Jay the best. And as I mentioned earlier, this family, they grew up extremely, extremely rough. They probably had to deal with some things that were just really rough. But this story, and going back to that family, the mother, Mama Joe, every morning when I'd go up there, we'd be going to get loaded up at my Fred's house, and we'd pick up Josh as we was coming down the holler. We'd pick up Jay. And every morning I'd come up there, Joe would be out on the porch, smoking her a Marlboro 100. She'd always holler at me. I'd roll the window down, be like, "How you doing this morning?" She'd be like, "So no, get your ass in here and eat you something for breakfast. You're looking mighty peaked. You're looking a little skinny." So I'd pull in, and you know, this family, they didn't have a lot, but she, about every morning, she knew what I was into during those years. Into drugs and whatnot. She's like, "Come on in here, I'm gonna fix you a biscuit or two." She'd fix me a biscuit or two of country ham. She'd fry me up an egg or two and throw on them. Fix me a cup of coffee. She was always, this family, they were always just so kind to me and Fred. Although to outsiders they may look like they could be a wild crowd, they were always just so friendly and kind to us. And Jay, he was the most level-headed out of the 7 siblings. He was into mischief and things, just like us, but he was, I think, the only one out of that family, out of the siblings, that had never made it to jail. He was fairly level-headed. He had a wild side, of course, but he was a little more controlled, you could say. But anyways, I'm just trying to illustrate this. I'm trying to paint a picture for you. You see, as I mentioned earlier, Gene and C went up to Chicago to work, raise money to bring back home. Gene was wanting to start his own contracting business, building back up in our village. But they would go up to Chicago and other cities up north for several months at a time and make them some money. Well, I think I mentioned that they were In this particular story, this would have been, I believe, in the mid-70s. My friend Fred told me this story several years ago, and I've never forgot it. They had been up there working, and they were living in some fairly rough apartments on the Chicago's south side, I believe. And one Friday, they got paid every Friday. They'd go to the bank or the credit union, cash their check, and put their money up. Well, one particular Friday night, they'd went and got them something to eat after cashing their check. And they come back to their apartment. And they open the door. And there's a black man sitting there on one of their beds. He's got a revolver pointed at him. And he's like, "You hillbilly motherfuckers know why I'm here." He robbed them, took their money, some of their other possessions that they had on them. This frightened Gene quite a bit. But as far as C went, it infuriated him. And that particular Friday evening, that black man won out. He victimized Gene and C. Gene put up the idea that perhaps maybe they should just try to find another apartment. But C just calmly told him not to worry about it, that he'd take care of the situation. Gene knew of C's potentially brutal nature, but he also knew that he wasn't going to change C's mind. So the next week came. They went to work. Friday rolled along. And on this particular Friday, see, Gene and C were extremely hard workers, as a lot of the people that had to come away from Appalachia to work in these other cities in the industrial north had to be. But this particular Friday, the following Friday, payday, C decides, he's like, "Gene, I called in to work. Just bring my paycheck home to me tonight." Gene had a vague idea of what was about to happen. Well, Gene went off to work, went and cashed his check, and put C's check in his pocket, of course. He went and ate alone at a diner that they typically ate at, and then he came home to the apartment. When he got to the apartment, it was just C there, just relaxing, listening to the radio, smoking a cigarette. And Gene walked in, took his work boots off, and was like, "Well, C, did the thief come by?" And he's like, "Yeah, he came by. I took care of him." Gene knew better than to ask what method was used. But C had waited in the apartment that afternoon and evening. Around dark, the thief, the black man, had broken in. And I don't know the details. Don't really care to know the details. But C killed him. I don't know if he beat him to death. I don't know if he just strangled him. I don't know if he used a weapon of opportunity. If you've ever read Dave McGowan's book, Program to Kill, you'll know what a weapon of opportunity is. It's just a weapon, say a killer snatches up, maybe a hammer, God knows what. and uses it to commit the deed. Gene told Fred this story when he was a child, when he was a young man. He'd never told anyone that story. Gene was kind of frightened, you could say, worried that the police would end up showing up. But they worked up there for about 3 or 4 months afterwards, and the police never came. It's untelling where C had hidden the thief's carcass. You know, like I said, the only reason I'm telling you this story is a sort of remoralization. And also, the parties involved have been dead for a long while. But this story just goes to show you that the heritage Appalachian, whether he be usually of a mixture, or whether he be of English, Northern English, Ulster Scot, or German ancestry, is not a figure to be trifled with, and that retribution is often not far from these people's minds if they've been wronged. You know, I never knew C, and like I said, I'd heard that he could be an extremely brutal and vicious man, a wild man. But I guess if there's any moral to this story, that moral would be that sometimes in this mortal coil that we live in, sometimes you certainly need the bad man, the vicious man, to protect anything that is good in this world. Anyways, that's the tale I had for you. I know it's rambling. I went into a lot of detail. My friends Jay and Fred, they're doing really well for themselves nowadays. I still talk to them. I just thought this was an interesting story. A story to instill a bit of pride in the heritage Appalachian, and by extension, the white man all across the world. Anyways, thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.